Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second talk of the day, me following the keynote. My name's Giles. I'm talking about Apache CloudStack, Introduction to Building Clouds with Apache CloudStack. This isn't the biggest audience I've ever spoken to, but I guess the fact that it's like walking up the north face of the Eiger or Mont Blanc or something to get here, maybe there's 50 people stuck on the steps or something like that. Okay, so just about me, I'm a long-time committer and PMC member of Apache CloudStack. This is really my first sort of open source experience. I've been involved in the project now for 7 years. My day job is I run a company called ShapeBlue, and we provide services around Apache CloudStack. But we are an open source first company. We believe 100% in the project that we work in and spend a lot of our lives working in that project. I run also the European user group around CloudStack. I'm just going to get this out here now. Even though I'm a committer and PMC member, I spend my day running a business. Okay? I don't spend my day architecting solutions or writing code. I used to do that a long time ago. So this talk today is going to sort of reflect that. I'm going to talk about the history of the project. I'm going to talk about some of the use cases around CloudStack. Going to demo it to you and give you an idea about how you'd go and build your first or even your second CloudStack environment. Long time ago, I was a physicist, a software engineer. I've got married with a couple of kids, do a bit of running, coach rugby, and you'll be pleased to know I'm British and European, or I consider myself British and European. Read into that what you like. Okay, so we're here to talk about Apache CloudStack. Quick show of hands. Who has used, deployed, played with Apache CloudStack? Okay, I'm getting that at about 20% of the room. Who has heard of Apache CloudStack before this talk? Okay, that's interesting. So some people are turning up to this talk and actually haven't heard anything about this project. And that's really what we're trying to do during this talk, is actually just get you familiar with the technology and understand its use cases. CloudStack is, I'm going to read this in full, scalable, multi-tenant, open source, purpose-built cloud orchestration platform. That's the key piece. It's a cloud orchestration platform. It's for building infrastructure as a service clouds. Okay? Over the years, we've had different sort of definitions of what this type of technology does. Cloud management platforms, infrastructure automation platforms. But basically what it's doing is taking a load of infrastructure bits and delivering it out through an API, through a GUI, through a command line to allow you to access that infrastructure as code or as a user. In terms of the building blocks of CloudStack, you need to just sort of think back. Think of Amazon, AWS, think of EC2, which has been around for, 10 years or something like that now? And this slide was, I saw this at an Amazon meetup about 10 years ago. It's how they were explaining what EC2 was, right? Which was they were saying, okay, we've got some infrastructure components, some network, some storage, compute. We're going to put on top of that a hypervisor. What Amazon did 10 years ago is they took and modified a fork of Zen server. We're going to build a CMP or an orchestration layer on top. Amazon built their own. Okay, that's going to present an API, and of course they were selling instances, Amazon, so that was their use case. So they put an e-commerce platform on top, and they already had an e-commerce platform because they were selling books and CDs and everything. And really, CloudStack is there to allow us to recreate those EC2 style services. So we make the assumption that an organization has got some compute, some network, and some storage. We pop a hypervisor on top, or with CloudStack, one of the key points is we can pop different multiple hypervisors on top. We say we're hypervisor agnostic, which read into that is we support a whole load of different hypervisors. CloudStack then sits on top. It presents an API, and that can then be accessed by whatever the tooling is you've got on top of that. Okay? We have a command line tool called Cloud Monkey, which will sit on top of the REST API. But then it just depends what you're then doing or what the use case is for CloudStack. If you are using it to provide public cloud services, and a lot of people do that, you might put that e-commerce platform on top. People increasingly underpinning a Kubernetes environment, for example, with CloudStack or another container offering. Whatever it is, whatever it is your actual use case is on top, what CloudStack is doing underneath is automating the infrastructure. And it's something worth talking about. Is this is a project that's been around. I'll explain the history in a second, for about 10 years, and people increasingly say, well, isn't that sort of old news? That's orchestrating a virtualized infrastructure layer. That we're going to be doing this with containers in the next few years. It's probably true, but what we're seeing is increasing demand for people who just want to abstract away the physical bit of the infrastructure. Okay, the value to the organization these days isn't at the CloudStack layer. The value is above that, but they just want to fire and forget when it comes to infrastructure, and that's where CloudStack is seeing a lot of success at the moment. In terms of headline features, broad and deep hypervisor support, that's key. We support all of those different hypervisors, including, has anybody seen XCP-ng yet? It's effectively a fork of Zen server. So some guys based in, where are they based? Somewhere in France, have taken to market a new open source version of Zen. So we support a whole range of hypervisors, and we can mix and match those in our CloudStack environment. CloudStack also has its own virtualized networking model, cloud networking model. I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. It's very, very scalable by design. Largest known deployment of CloudStack sat at about 35,000 physical compute hosts sat underneath it. It provides high availability functionality, and then we access it through a UI, a REST API, or a command line. I'm going to do some demos in a second. I'm just going to use the UI so you can see what's going on. In terms of its history, as of today, CloudStack is an Apache project, and it has been a top-level project since 2013. Its history is sort of quite interesting because it came originally from a startup, a Silicon Valley startup called VMOps, and they were called Cloud.com. They got acquired by Citrix, who wanted to get hold of this thing and saw a sort of commercial model around it, and quite quickly realized with other things that were going on in the space that open source was the way forward. So they took the code, the intellectual property, the trademark and everything, and donated it into the ASF. And that's when people like us got involved once it became an open source project. Citrix have since exited the project. There's still a few people hanging around who are involved in sort of legacy, but they exited the project 2016. And as a project, it continues in a steady state. I can't say we're gaining massive momentum. We have a reasonable amount of momentum already, and that continues to be pretty constant. We do, as a community, 3 to 4 releases a year, just depending on how quickly we can get the releases out and how long it takes us to vote on them. We have a lot of very large organizations depend on CloudStack, and we see that adoption increasing. That's the really healthy news. In terms of the use cases, they fall into 2 camps. So we have a lot of public cloud providers who are delivering their EC2 style services underpinned by CloudStack. Okay? And you could argue that's CloudStack's heartland. But increasingly, we're seeing non-service providers, that's the rest of the world, the rest of the world we traditionally call enterprise organizations, deploying CloudStack to underpin other things in their organization. We have 2 sort of release cycles. We have a standard release cycle, and we also have an LTS release cycle. A lot of people are looking for stability in terms of long-term support, where we as a community commit to sort of supporting that release for about 2 years. And key thing about our community, it's user-driven. We don't have any big vendors. We don't have a dominant vendor in the Apache CloudStack community, which I think is reasonably unusual for a significant open source project. Most of our contributors come from user organizations. Okay? In terms of the sort of metrics around the project, we've got 200 committers in the project, a very diverse PMC from all sorts of different organizations. And just to sort of give you an idea, scale-wise, I just pulled the figures the other day. In 4 weeks, 400 mailing list messages, 60 different people contributing, 34 PRs, and 1,600 package downloads. So we have 2 locations to download our packages, and we're averaging around 1,600 a month. Okay, so we're getting a lot of people pulling our software. We're getting new users popping up all of the time. Okay, lots of stuff going on community-wise. There's meetups happen in London. There's meetups happen in Berlin, in Dresden. There's meetups focused around CloudStack. We have this whole thing with CloudStack. We have a lot of people who are using the technology that we don't really know are using the technology, like any other open source project, particularly Apache projects where we don't track usage. These people pop up at meetups, and we've never heard of them before, and suddenly it's like, you've been using CloudStack for 5 years, hasn't it? And we also run our own conference every year, CloudStack Collab. That's going to be happening we're doing it on the back of ApacheCon in Montreal in September. Okay, so I mentioned the use cases, private cloud, public cloud, obviously hybrid cloud sits in the middle. Just to give you an idea of the users, this isn't a customer slide for the organization I work with. This is people who are using Apache CloudStack, okay? Notice in there lots of big service providers, Korea Telecom, British Telecom, KDDI, who are Japan's biggest telco service provider. And I tend to think of them as the tier 2 IaaS providers. They're not the hyperscalers. They're not Google, Amazon, Microsoft. They're the next level down, okay? And then lots of other organizations. Anybody from any of these organizations in the room? No? Okay. And then lots of other organizations, some of them aren't service providers. And we traditionally, as a project, we've been really, really bad at tracking our usage. This is a sort of organic, open source set of logos that's been compiled in the community over the years as people have sort of said, hey, we're using CloudStack. But we're not very good at that whole marketing and engagement side as a project. The other thing we do have is, and I know this through some of the commercial work I do, is we do have a whole bunch of really interesting users who just refuse to talk about their use of cloud, and in fact refuse to talk about their use of any software, okay? We have some massive organizations, and if you hang out in our community long enough, you quickly work out who some of these organizations are, but we're not allowed to put their logos on slides and things. They get very upset. Okay, so in terms of what you can do with CloudStack, it's basically a self-service platform for all of those infrastructure components, okay? Idea, creating virtual machines, all of the virtual machine lifestyle operations, networking operations, because it has its own virtual networking model. We've got a number of different types of networking models. You also obviously manage things like firewall port forwarding rules, load balancing, etc., all done through a GUI or through the API or the command line. So, again, quick show of hands in the room. Who has actually seen CloudStack before? Sorry, I asked a similar question earlier. Okay, so there's enough of you interested in having a quick look at CloudStack. Sign of my age, I'm afraid. I have to put these on to do a demo these days. Okay. Okay, so just to explain here, I'm VPN'd into our lab at work, so I'm not using a public-facing address there. This is the CloudStack GUI. We only have one GUI. It's used for both administration purposes, and then a reduced version of that GUI is used for users of the environment. Okay, I'm logged on as a domain admin here, so I can show you lots of different things. As a user, I would get just a slightly restricted version of this. Okay. Let's just start with some basics in terms of I can go and look at all of my instances. These are my virtual machines. These could be based on any different type of hypervisor, depends what the administrator's got configured in the environment. And I can click into those machines and do some quick lifestyle operations on it, start, stop it. I can view its console, I can reset its password, etc., etc. I can take a snapshot of that machine, for example. If I want to add an instance, we have a wizard to walk us through. We have a concept of zones in CloudStack. A zone is very similar to a region in Amazon. It basically maps to a data center. I've only got one here because it's just a small lab environment, but you might see a London zone, an Amsterdam zone, a Berlin zone. It's where I want to deploy that machine to. Okay, I choose a template that I want to base the machine on. Again, here I've only got a small select number because I'm in the lab. I'll tell you what I am finding. This is the first time, as I'm getting older, where I've had to wear glasses to do a presentation, and you have to keep taking them on and off. Okay, so I'm just going to choose to build a small CentOS machine. I choose the service offering I want, which is basically how many virtual CPUs, how much memory, how much root disk space I want for that machine. Very similar to an instance size in Amazon. And again, all of this is configured when you configure the CloudStack environment in terms of those choices. I'm just going to choose small. Okay. What disk offering, if I want additional storage with it. I can have affinity groups to make sure it goes onto the same physical host or stays away from the same physical host. Actually, let me just go back there. I now choose what network I want to put that machine on. I've got one here called, one I was using, called RootNet. There's nothing special about that name. It's just the name I've given it. Or I could choose multiple networks. In fact, that's my default now. Okay, or I could go and create a new network. And depending on the networking model we have deployed in CloudStack, CloudStack's going to go off and orchestrate the virtual networking components required to build a new network, configure all the interfaces, get this machine on it, and I can then manage that as well through the GUI. Okay, I can my SSH key pairs, give it a test. And off we go. CloudStack's going off, talking, sending commands down to the hypervisor to go and create that instance, building the storage required for it, getting it on the network, building any new networking components we need to actually make that happen, which isn't an instant thing. It depends on the size of the machine, where your zone is, et cetera, et cetera. There you go. 20 seconds or something like that. And I can now go and handle lifecycle operations. In fact, if I'm quick and I look at the console, here we'll see that machine actually booting now the instance has been created. What was that? CentOS. Yep, so you can see the instance actually booting. So it's all about abstracting the control of that infrastructure out through the user interface of the API. Just very quickly, if I drill down into, for example, network, I can then look at my networks. What was that one on? That one, I think. No, it wasn't. Okay, see what IP addresses I've got on my network, and then I can go and configure my firewall load balancing port forwarding rules into that network. So, for example, I could take an instance, open up certain ports out to the public internet, for example. In fact, I've got a web server somewhere. Let's have a look. Yeah. I've got a web server called Giles' web server, and if I want to port forward to that, okay, where I want to forward to, there's my web server. Bang. And this is CloudStack now orchestrating its virtual networking model, which is this multi-tenant networking model, to allow me as a user to actually go and build ultimately quite a complex network environment if I want to. I don't know what the IP address, 10.1.35.87. Somebody remind me, 3587. Yeah. Okay, so as a user, very simply, I've created a virtual machine. I've created some port forwarding firewall rules to let traffic in on a certain port for that. And that's as a consumer, a user of CloudStack. This isn't an administrator function. Okay, the other thing I mentioned, we have an API and a command line. Okay, so just a couple of examples there from our REST API. So first command there is lists all the virtual machines that's being performed as an administrator. I could list all my templates, create a new network, create a new virtual machine. Now, just to be clear, most people who are using CloudStack are accessing it through the API and the command line, okay? The GUI tends to be for the configuration and management of CloudStack, but most people are in teams who want to provision bits of infrastructure, and they will have these API commands embedded in whatever scripting they're using for their tooling on top. That's the normal use case for CloudStack. And there's just a screenshot there. We have a command line tool called Cloud Monkey, which calls that REST API. So that's doing the same commands there through the command line. That can obviously be embedded in scripts, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. One of the big problems we have with CloudStack is we have a real perception problem with CloudStack. You know, I've showed you all those logos of some very, very big organizations. They're just the ones we know about, right? We know there's lots of other people running CloudStack who never tell us about it, okay? And this is a real quote from somebody we were doing some work with a few years ago at a very large company in Britain, who were doing an assessment of what they were going to use for their internal cloud, their private cloud. And we had a chat with them, and we said, okay, we think CloudStack's the right thing for you. And he said, I've never heard of CloudStack. Literally never heard of it. And we're like, how can you not have heard of this thing? So we have this perception problem, okay? That's the invisible man, because some people often used to describe it as CloudStack is the invisible man of cloud computing, okay? It's the best kept secret in the cloud. It's this thing being used by lots and lots of people, but nobody ever, we don't have this general awareness of it. And I just wanted to explain the reasons, or the way I see it, the reasons for that. If we look at the hype curve back in 2011, Gartner's curve, everything was about private cloud and cloud computing. It was the thing that was on, every conference was called cloud something else, okay? And that's when CloudStack was emerging through the startup and Citrix and becoming an Apache project around that time. And the problem we had is, does that translate? That's from Google Translate. Does that? Yeah. We were in the wrong place at the wrong time because we got this brilliant technology that's being adopted, and ultimately, that was us stood there, and there were all these bulls charging in the other direction who were all obsessing around another project or collection of projects which was in the same space as Apache CloudStack. Anybody like to tell me what that? OpenStack, right? And this was the problem, and everybody, because it's all hyped, everybody, particularly the analysts, also, let's have a big debate about CloudStack versus OpenStack. And it really was. This is a competitive thing, but those of us working in CloudStack went, these aren't the same things. They're two quite different things, but the industry wanted to perceive that this was a two-horse race. And that was really frustrating for us as a project, because in terms of mind share, commercial interest in CloudStack around vendors, etc., nobody wanted to look at us. Okay? We knew things were going well, but we really suffered from that perception. And a lot of that, touching on what was mentioned in the keynote this morning, you look at the mission of the ASF is to provide software for the greater good, right? And you look at the mission of, she was talking this morning about the Linux Foundation. Here I'm talking about the OpenStack Foundation. The mission has words like promoting ubiquitous, growing the ecosystem, okay, pay to play, getting the commercial interest. Apache just doesn't do that, okay? And I agree. I think that's the correct model, because you build more organic software that lasts longer because it's not getting pulled around by vendors, okay? But sometimes it makes it very difficult when you're in a project that happens to be in a space with one of these other projects around at the same time. But But just finishing up on that, the reason CloudStack has still had a reasonable amount of success despite that is that's the dependency diagram. It's a few years old now from various OpenStack projects. That's, just to get over the idea of the complexity of building an OpenStack environment. CloudStack is, I would describe it as integrated, but I'm quite diplomatic with these things. Some people would describe it as monolithic. Okay? It does all of those bits in one management platform. Okay? There's no linking up of 15 different APIs and having that upgrade nightmare when you've got a purely distributed, a properly distributed system. It gets easier. And that's why people are actually using CloudStack. It's integrated, it's easy to install, it's proven at scale, it just works. Relatively low cost to run and operate. It's led by the user community, so it's not jumping off in different directions. And that's really something that's quite interesting. A lot of the people we work with commercially, the reason they like one of the reasons they choose CloudStack is if they need to start working on a feature set somewhere, a community of a few hundred people is a lot easier to deal with a community of 5,000 people with half of the world's software vendors in it. Okay, so they like that level, the fact we have quite a tightly defined scope. And we often say in the project, from our viewpoint, CloudStack works. It just works. It's a relatively simple technology. Okay. In fact, I have a T-shirt here that says CloudStack works. In fact, we've got a load of T-shirts over there you must take at the end of this talk. Okay. So in terms of it, very, very flexible platform with tightly integrated, a tightly defined scope. In terms of your hypervisor, we'll support anything. Okay. In terms of your compute, pretty much, your storage, we will pretty much support anything. Okay. Anything that the hypervisor will support, and secondary storage is slightly more limited. We have two networking models that you can configure on what we call a per zone environment in CloudStack. Advanced networking allows me the full functionality that I just described there in terms of it's sitting at layer 2, creating virtual networking appliances that the user can then manage. We also have a basic networking model which just uses security groups at the hypervisor level, similar to Amazon EC2. And you can have an environment with multiple combinations of those. And then in terms of the services that our networking model provides, it's all of the stuff you would actually expect. We've got a set of constructs in CloudStack, the top level one being a region, which is it's a superset up from an Amazon region. Okay, so it's a loosely coupled CloudStack environment. So you might have a region which is North America and one that's Europe. Zones then map normally to a data center, but I could have multiple zones on one laptop if I wanted to. Within a zone, you have a pod, and a pod construct is normally a rack. So it's some top-of-rack switching, some compute hosts, and some storage. In a pod, we have a cluster, and that's the point at where we define what hypervisor it's going to be. And then, obviously, in clusters, we have hosts. So, how common is it to have? Yeah, how common is it to have several clusters in one host? I don't think particularly common. He looks to Paul, who builds these things every day.
Yeah, I mean, because you potentially have a limit of usually somewhere around about 8 or so hosts in a cluster. So then you've got a whole load of people in a pod. You would have at least 2, 3, 4 clusters in a pod. Just to look at it. Yeah, and also to give some separation as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You could have one of each of these if you wanted to. Or you could have hundreds of them. Okay, in terms of the deployment model of CloudStack, so you've got those constructs we're talking about before. I've got here a number of pods. number of hosts, each with their own primary storage. Primary storage is where the hypervisor storage. Okay, so it normally needs to be a reasonable performance level. We also have a concept called secondary storage, which is where we put our static artifacts, snapshots, templates, those sort of things, and that can generally be lower grade storage. The key thing from this diagram to realize is that CloudStack itself is effectively a thing called a management server with a MySQL database sat underneath it. That management server is the control plane. What that is doing is sending hypervisor commands. It's talking to storage, and some vendors, we have some very deep storage integration, and it's also creating virtualized networking components, okay? It sits there as a control plane, okay? It's not in the critical path of the actual virtual machines, the virtualized environments themselves, okay? Which is a key design principle of CloudStack. We can take all of this out of the picture, literally switch off our management server, that infrastructure doesn't stop working, okay? It's just there as an automation control plane. Just something that may be of interest, we've recently done some integration. We have a thing called the CloudStack Container Service. CloudStack Container Service is basically CloudStack Kubernetes integration, and it got driven from service providers wanting to do a container as or a Kubernetes as a service offering in their existing virtualized environments. And what this is doing is going and spinning up a load of instances, bringing down the Kubernetes images, and spinning up a Kubernetes cluster at that level, and then allowing pass-through access into the Kubernetes dashboard itself. Okay, so the title of this talk is Building Clouds with Apache CloudStack. I'm going to just talk through a couple of recipes. The first one is almost like my first POC, my first CloudStack build, if anybody's interested. In fact, I have a very pretty bit of imagery there. So that first recipe, so you walk away from this talk, you think this is interesting, we might be using this, might have a look at this in our organization, you want to go and play, right? You want to go and have a look at this technology, okay? So that first recipe is completely ignore any of the stuff I've talked about in terms of the separate management server, etc. You want quick and easy. What you need is a hypervisor host. In theory, you can do this on all of this on one host, but that won't really give you what you want to do a POC. You would need a hypervisor host. You need some NFS storage, a CloudStack management server, and a MySQL server. Go about that. First thing is do go to our docs repository, have a look at the getting started guide at the beginning, just so you understand the basic setup and deployment model. You see some of it on these diagrams here. Read up on our networking models, okay? Only need the introduction at this stage, yeah? Do it, though, because one of the first questions you're going to get asked when you add a zone is what networking model do you want to use? And unless you know what those two things mean, you're going to get that wrong. You'll have a whole load of questions about, does CloudStack support this? Does it support this? Does it support this sort of storage? Generally, the answer is, well, it depends what the hypervisor supports. Yeah? We talk to those hypervisors. When it comes to then what they support, that's where the mapping is. Okay? Do not try to do this in a existing virtualized environment like AWS. CloudStack is there to talk directly to hypervisor. Our lab runs with nested virtualization. In fact, we have CloudStack inside CloudStack in our lab, but that is not an easy thing to do, and it will not give you a true representation of what the technology is about. So, start CloudX. I don't think I finished. Okay, method. Install MySQL, install CloudStack from one of the repos I'll share with you in a second, start its services, and then follow the GUI. Yeah, so it has a first run GUI, which will ask you about adding infrastructure, adding hosts, building zones, etc., which is pretty intuitive. Okay? What you end up with that first build is effectively two hosts, one which is your management server that's running your NFS storage and MySQL all on the same box, and then some sort of hypervisor. Okay? Also a switch that will give you VLAN support if you want to use our advanced networking, our layer 2 isolation model, because we need VLANs to be able to do that. Okay? That's normally, well, it would take Paul or me, an hour to do that. If you're new to CloudStack, realistically, by the time you've done the reading and everything, you'll lose a day getting that to a working situation. What that will do is let you play with most of the functionality in CloudStack. Certain things will be missing. Now, the other thing not to underestimate is learning the features of CloudStack. For example, how its virtual private cloud, its VPC mechanism works, which is one of the networking types we have. Okay? You don't have to build your own environment to do that because, as I said, there's loads of service providers who are running CloudStack to deliver their services. In fact, we have some of them in the room today. These are people I'm not recommending them commercially. I'm recommending them because their UI, which is that's their own UI. That's not the CloudStack UI, but is very similar in terms of functionality, and they've used the same terminology as CloudStack. And you could get a trial account with these guys, and sit and experiment, for example, with networking to see how these things work. And that is I'm guessing, a Node.js-based UI, which just sits on top of the CloudStack REST API. Okay, so trial account, and you can then let somebody else do the hard work. Another one, Exoscale in Switzerland. Their services all run on CloudStack. Theirs is slightly more abstracted, but again, you'll get the same ideas over. Okay, so you've got to where you want to go in terms of you've proved the concept, you've got it installed, you like what you see. You now want to start to work up some further ideas and get towards putting this into some sort of dev or production environment. Second recipe would be to actually really start to explore how CloudStack is going to work in your environment. Okay? So first thing I'd do there is put in some more realistic storage. And when I say more realistic, something aligned to what you would end up using in your production environment instead of just NFS sat on one of your two hosts that you've created. Split that out into primary and secondary storage because you want to see how the performance of those two types of storage is going to affect your environment. Add at least one more host, okay? At least one more. The reason for that is some of the really clever stuff that CloudStack does is deploy workloads into the correct place. It has a very complicated and open deployment algorithm model. So in very large environments, we want to get virtual machines running in particular places, and you may well want to test that. And you can't test that if you've only got one host very easily. And you obviously can't test HA. Start to think about pods and clusters, maybe start to think about almost artificially putting in a second cluster, a second pod, and maybe introduce a second hypervisor. And one of the reasons I say that, often in an organization, the hypervisor choice is sort of made at the beginning. That's what we use. We are a KVM shop. That's what we're going to do. We support a subset of all hypervisor functionality, but that has to be a core subset. Okay? So you will see some slightly different behaviors across different hypervisors in terms of what we are able to support. Okay? You may want to explore that. So you might want to look at how KVM stands up against VMware, etc. And the other thing with that is that we talk to different hypervisors different ways. Because the point is CloudStack abstracts that. You just see an API. But with KVM, for example, we have an agent on the host. Okay? With VMware, we don't have an agent. We talk to it through vCenter. Okay? So we're using different communication techniques. You might want to get comfortable with how that all hangs together. Split your environment out into a management farm with ideally multiple MySQL servers, master slave, and redundant management server. This is sort of production style stuff, but this is the sort of stuff you want to be experimenting with. You want to understand how the management servers fail over before you start building your production environment. And CloudStack's got 4 different types of network. I'm not going to go through all of those now. That would take an hour or two on its own. But those 4 different types of network, best practice is we split the traffic out. Okay? So public versus its management network, because we don't want people to be sat on that same network. And with the first recipe, you wouldn't. You'd just be lumping it all together. Start to think about splitting that traffic out so you can see what effect that has. And you're, by the end of that recipe, getting towards a very, very small production-looking environment. And that's the stage people are normally getting to by the time they then work up their production designs for CloudStack. I'm not going to take you through a whole design session on designing a production environment. I think I got a slightly out-of-date version of my presentation. When look at that, some picture about restaurant quality, which I meant to add a picture about restaurant quality. Okay, so the things to then get that to the stage in terms of designing it for production. Look at your workloads. Look at what sort of requirements are going to be there for your workloads. That has design considerations in terms of the required storage performance, the capacity you need in terms of CPU, in terms of memory, what sort of hosts you need, and ultimately how you configure CloudStack to orchestrate all of those, okay? Sometimes it's difficult to think about your workloads because if you're a public cloud provider, you have no idea what those workloads are going to be. But most organizations can see a pattern around those workloads in terms of their size, their operating system, the I/O intensity they have, that sort of thing, okay? Think about some capacity planning, particularly around storage and memory. You need to think about what version of CloudStack you're going to take out into a production build. So you need to look at our release cycle. We will always say go with one of their LTS unless you're feeling very, very brave, because it means you're going to have two years of community action around it. Choose what networking model you want to use, basic or advanced. Get to a management farm. Management farm normally and often sits in a virtualized environment itself, but certainly not under the control of CloudStack. It sits in a separate virtualized environment. Choosing your hypervisor, again, by looking at your workloads. Really think about the network design. There's some great, Paul, who's my colleague here, has written some brilliant articles on CloudStack's networking model. There's a lot in the documentation, etc. But really think about how those 4 separate networks are going to sit together. Choose your scale point. So we were talking earlier, how, we design this thing to think everybody starts building these environments thinking, oh, it's going to be massive eventually, particularly the public cloud providers, because they're going to they all think they're going to hyperscale. But nobody wants to build that massive environment from the beginning. So you have to design for an environment that is going to scale nicely horizontally, but you want to start with a very small actual infrastructure. And that's pretty much the same with anybody who's doing this, okay? So find your scale points. Are you going to scale the environment by cluster, so adding new hypervisor clusters, or are you going to scale by a pod design where you're taking the switching and the cluster, et cetera? And that's what most organizations do. So we have a design of a pod that we can just drop in more and more and more pods as the environment grows. Then some sort of preparation and planning, getting your templates right. So all of those templates I was choosing from to build an instance, you have to plan what templates you're going to have. The service offerings, which is the size of the offerings that people can have, disk offerings. CloudStack has a very rich tagging model, which lets us tag particular hosts, particular storage types, anything by giving it a tag. So for example, I could have a high-performance storage tier, and I could tag that as a high-performance storage tier, and then I can associate different service offerings, different things to say, go and use that storage tier, okay? Or particular hosts, which are very, very powerful for high-performance computing. Then the user doesn't have to choose that, which just means if we get one of these service offering types, one of these requests to build one of these things, we go and put it into that sort of environment. And we could tag to put things in physical different locations as well. Okay. The other thing that a lot of organizations forget about is CloudStack has some very detailed usage data. It creates a usage database of everything that everybody has ever consumed in terms of infrastructure. So, virtual machines and storage and network usage, etc. And most organizations want to then analyze that, whether it's because they're a public cloud provider, they want to charge money for it, or internal chargeback. And CloudStack basically just gives you a very basic set of data to work with. There's third-party products out there which will analyze it for you and present it out through a UI. A lot of people just write their own analysis tools around that. Okay, so hopefully that's given you an insight in terms of building your first CloudStack environment, if you're interested in doing so. The steps to take in terms of a basic POC, evolving that slightly, and then some of the design considerations. That's a very, very brief summary. There's a lot out there published, a lot more detail than this. Okay. In terms of where to go next, there's a link. Obviously, I'll share this slide there. There's a link to our documents, docs.cloudstack.apache.org. Join our mailing list if you want to do some work with CloudStack. Our users mailing list is a very, very friendly place to new users. Hey, I listened to this guy called Giles who said it was all going to be easy, and it's not that easy. Somebody will help you in that mailing list. Very, very friendly to new people. And there's lots of events and meetups going on. From a European viewpoint, there's a LinkedIn group, which is effectively the membership database for the European guys, and a website there for the collaboration conferences. As with any other open source project, get into the community, come and say hello, and you'll get some help if you're getting stuck. Okay, there are my contact details if anybody wants to get in touch. Has anybody got any questions? Have we got a microphone for the questions?
I'm sorry, I lost the access to my...
Okay, I will have to repeat the question.
There is a quite active German contact in the room, and people are interested, maybe find a way to share it.
Yeah.
What's the best way to share it?
There's an active German user group who have had meetups here in Berlin, in
Meetups, Berlin and Leipzig, Frankfurt. There's one plan in Stuttgart now. There's even an old mailing list where we are more direct contact that you can ask more stupid questions. Official mailing list.
Yeah. So to repeat that for the recording, there's lots of meetups going on in Germany all over the place. The LinkedIn group, I think, works very well in terms of there is actually also a meetup group as well with exactly the same name for the CloudStack European group. Have you got your own? But if you give me the link to anything you've got, I can put that in the slide. So for the benefit of anybody wants to go and find those. Any other questions? Have we built a CentOS 7 system with KVM? Yes. As I'm looking over to the man who does this for a living. Yes. As in CloudStack on CentOS 7? Or orchestrating?
So the host and the guest on CentOS 7.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Is there a preference on type of hypervisor?
Specifically on that slide where you're only having one host. If you're doing
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of that, my first build recipe would normally be Zen or KVM. Yeah, because we talk to VMware through vCenter, so instantly that's going to get a lot more complicated. And it's worth noticing, we support all those different hypervisors. different organizations have different interests because they tend to run one hypervisor or another. So we almost get this thing within our community. We try and police it and make sure we maintain similar support for all the hypervisors. But for example, our OVM support is not particularly loved because there's only a few people who are really interested in that. There's a lot of people interested in our KVM support, in our VMware support, and it just depends on who is working in those different hypervisor areas. Yeah. 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 Okay. I think we're out of time.
Definitely.
Ah.
Will we continue in a few minutes with Paul's presentation? So thanks a lot.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. And there are CloudStack t-shirts over there. Please take one. Otherwise, we'll have to take them back to London with us. Thank you.